I appreciate everyone joining me on my poker journey. I'm very excited for this vlog. This was my biggest winning session to date. There's some massive pots throughout this session, and I hope that you enjoy this first of a two-part series. I open up Ace of Spades, Jack of Hearts to $20 under the gun. We see a 3-bet from Saint in the cutoff to $40 with Ace of Diamonds, King of Diamonds. Abe makes the cold call with 8 of diamonds, 7 of diamonds on the button, and it gets back to me. I think that Saint has a relatively wide range. I'm not sure at this point if his clickback is generally going to be strength or super weak. In the moment, I was leaning towards it was a weaker 3-bet, especially with the wide ranges he had played in previous hands. But we were also early on in the session. Ace Jack off is not a hand that I generally want to be playing multi-way, although I think it is reasonable for the price I'm getting here. But I do decide to 4-bet to $160. Saint thinks for a little bit and he makes the call, and it gets to Abe. And I think Abe is relatively priced in here with a suited connector, but I think a fold is very reasonable as well. We go to a flop with a pot of $487, and the flop is relatively dry with the 3 of hearts, 2 of diamonds, 10 of clubs. Generally, I'm going to have a massive range and nut advantage on these dry boards. I don't expect my opponents to really have any hands that connect too strongly with the 3 or the deuce. And if they do have a 10, I often have 6 live cards. So I will be betting here at a very high frequency for a small sizing. I bet $125 into 487, so around quarter pot. Saint tanks for a little bit and makes the fold. I think in this spot, generally I would like to see Saint continuing with backdoor straight, backdoor flush, and overcards, as well as being ahead of most of my bluffs, but he does make the fold, and Abe has a pretty easy fold. So we start the session winning a decent sized pot with no showdown. We have a early position open from Josue with 8 of clubs, 7 of clubs to $15. Saint flats with pocket 8s in the +3 position, and we have Abe 3-betting to $65 from the hijack with ace king off. It folds to me, and I look down at pocket jacks in the big blind. I think this is going to be a high frequency 4-bet from this position. I think that Abe can be definitely a little wider in this spot with Josue opening and Saint flatting. I think Josue has slightly wide ranges pre-flop, and Saint has been playing a very wide range. I think this is a relatively good spot for Abe to squeeze in general. Regardless, I don't want to be cold calling with most hands to a 3-bet. I think when I call here with most of my range that we're going to see a call from behind by Josue and Saint at a high frequency. And generally, I'm not trying to play pots multi-way. I do decide to 4-bet. I size it up to $165. My standard here is generally going to be about 2.5x the 3-better. I can probably go slightly higher here if I want to, with the 2 players left behind to act before Abe, but I think this is essentially going to be my standard size in this spot. Josue makes the fold, and Saint surprisingly flats for 150 more. It gets to Abe, and he has to call $100 here. I think in Abe's spot, he can either flat here or 5-bet, and being in position definitely makes a flat a little bit more profitable than it would be otherwise. I think that my range is going to be very strong in this position normally when I'm cold 4-betting, so I don't mind him flatting over 5-betting if he prefers not to get it in. Although at these stack sizes, I think him getting it in is perfectly reasonable, especially with dead money in there from Saint at some frequency. We go to the flop with a pot of $512. The pot is the Queen of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds, 5 of Spades. I think generally this board is going to be very favorable to my range. I have overpairs. I have the strongest queen X here being ace queen and king queen, and I think a good portion of my opponent's ranges are going to be pocket pairs that are weaker than pocket jacks. My betting frequency here is mostly going to be dictated on if I have a range advantage. Because I do, I am going to be betting here with almost my entire range. My standard size here is always just going to be about a quarter pot. I see bet 125. Saint quickly moves in for $308 and Abe quickly folds behind. I think for this price, I'm going to be just putting it in with jacks every time. If he has a queen, he has a queen, but I think that Saint has been relatively wide this entire session thus far. So I think I'm ahead of the vast majority of his range here, and for the price we're getting, I think it's a relatively easy call. We do make the call. The turn runs out a 4 and the river runs out a king, and we scoop a 1.1k pot with pocket jacks versus Saint's pocket 8s. We have a straddle to $10 in this hand, and I open up pocket 5s in the +2 position. This hand is generally going to be a mix for me, and from early position I'm mostly going to be folding pocket 4s through pocket deuces. I get a call by Dirty in the big blind with 7 of hearts, 3 of clubs. Dirty has been relatively wide the entire session, but this is still relatively early on. We go to a flop for $92. The flop is the 9 of spades, 7 of diamonds, and 8 of clubs. Dirty donk bets out $50, so about half pot. I think versus a half pot sizing, I probably just need to be calling here when I have a pair and a gut shot, even though my gut shot really isn't that good. So I do make the call. We go to the turn with $192 in the pot. The turn is the 5 of hearts. So I make a set, but there's a one-liner to a straight out there. I think Dirty definitely has a lot of 6x here when he continues to barrel for $75. But I think that he also has a couple of bluffs, hands like 10x and jack x. And I think he has some 2-pair combos here. I think it is less likely for me to have as many straights as he does when I open up from early position compared to him calling in the big blind. His stack at this point is only $144 left, so I just go all in, expecting to get called by his hands like 10-9, which are a pair and a gut shot, and hands like 2-pair. I figure if he has a 6, he has a 6 at this point. The money's probably going in, and I still have 10 outs versus many of his straights. He thinks for a little bit and he makes the fold, and we scoop this pot. In this hand, I straddle under the gun to $10. Josue opens up pocket aces to $35 from early position. It folds around to me, and I call in the straddle with ace of hearts, jack of diamonds. We go to a flop with a pot of $77, and the flop is the king of diamonds, 9 of hearts, jack of spades. It is not a board that is favorable to my range as the big blind caller. This board heavily favors the early position opener, but I'm pretty happy with my specific holding, hitting middle pair here, although I will generally proceed with caution. I continue here with a check, and Josue decides to c-bet $40 into 77. At this point, I have a pretty standard call with a medium strength hand that wants to realize its equity and reach showdown. In general, I'm going to be playing mostly a call or a fold strategy versus the early position opener on these unfavorable boards, but I do have hands like Queen 10, so I do have occasional raises. I make the call and we go to a turn with the pot at $157. The turn is the jack of hearts, giving me trips with the best kicker. I check in flow, and Josue decides to check back. I think that Josue should be checking back here with aces at a pretty high frequency. He doesn't necessarily want to bloat the pot when I do have a lot of trip combos here, and I don't think he's necessarily going to be getting 3 streets of value against a king. The turn does bring in some flush draws, but I think that some of these draws I would have been raising on the flop, and I think I'm less likely to continue with pure back doors on this turn card facing a early position open. And I feel that I would be continuing less backdoor draws versus a early position open in general. If Josue did decide to bet, I would be raising this specific hand at a very high frequency, trying to obtain value from weaker Jack X and draws in his range. I think that he would have a much higher frequency of draws that c-bet flop and continue on this turn than I do getting to this turn card. Although I do think it is less likely that he has a jack in his range compared to me, as some of his jacks would have checked back on the flop, and I have a higher concentration of Jack X in my range that continues here when I call the big blind preflop. We go to the river, and the river is the Queen of Clubs. At this point, I still think my hand is a pretty clear value bet. I think it is unlikely that Josue has a full house here, and although Josue can have some 10x, and I think some of his combos like ace 10, queen 10, and jack 10 would have barreled the turn at a high frequency, and I'm not sure if he would be betting hands like 10-9 on the flop. Because of this, I think a lot of his value here is going to be hands like pocket aces, ace king, king queen, that I can still gain value from. But with a 4-liner to a straight, I don't think I can really use large sizes with my specific combo. So I opt to pro bet out here for about a third pot and put in $50. And I think for that sizing, Josue has a pretty standard call, and he does call quickly, and we see that we did get very lucky versus pocket aces. In this hand, we have a under the gun open by Hassan to $15 with jack 10 off. It folds around to dirty in the cutoff, and dirty makes the call with 8 deuce suited, and it gets to me in the big blind, and I have a very standard call here with pocket fours. With the price I'm getting and my position, I don't think I want to be really 3-betting this hand at any frequency. I do make the call, and we go to a flop with the pot at $47. The flop is the King of Hearts, 8 of Clubs, King of Diamonds. It checks around to dirty, and he bets $30 into 47 with his middle pair. I think that dirty has a very wide range in this spot. I think that he would be betting here with a lot of his air in general. He definitely could be betting a king here as well. I think he has a lot of kings, but I think he's also betting most of his value hands like 8x and pocket pairs for both value and denial. My hand specifically isn't a great call here with a player behind. On a paired board like this, I also have the chance of being counterfeited. Most of the cards in the deck are not very good for me just because I have such a small pocket pair that I don't know which overcards are going to be hitting my opponent's range, especially when it's dirty betting. I also think that my hand can be a low frequency raise, primarily going to be raising as a bluff / denial. I don't think I'm gaining too much value by worse hands. There's always a chance though that dirty decides to call with something like ace high with a backdoor flush and or a backdoor straight. I think a raise here as well puts a lot of pressure on dirty's medium value range, which is made up of 8x and pocket pairs. I'm not too worried with Hassan having a super strong range here. I think he would be c-betting most of his king x, so I think he's slightly capped towards having pocket pairs and air here. And I think when I raise here, Hassan is going to have to be folding the vast majority of those combos. Ultimately, I do decide to raise, and I raise dirty's $30 bet to 120. Action gets back to dirty, and I think he has a pretty tough spot here. I think I have a very high number of king x combos here, especially in the big blind. I think I will be overcalling especially a lot of the suited combos, which his specific hand is drawing dead to. There's also very few draws on this board, so I don't think there's any obvious bluffs that I have. So I think it's very hard for his 8x combos to continue here at a high frequency. If he did continue with an 8x combo, he would probably want to have a slightly stronger kicker, although having the backdoor flush draw is a little bit of additional equity. Ultimately, he does decide to make the fold, and we pick up a small pot. We have a limp from early position from dirty with king 10 off. It gets to me in the cutoff and I raise to $50. I think this is a pretty clear spot to one raise for value and for isolation. The button folds and Josue decides to 3-bet to $150 from the small blind. Relatively small sizing in a 3-bet pot out of position, but it's probably fine. I would definitely be going closer from 4.5x the opening size. I make the call and we go to the flop with a pot of $325. The flop is the 8 of spades, 10 of hearts, 9 of hearts. So I flop open-ended. Josue checks, it gets to me. I think my hand can be a mix here. I think specifically my hand has a decent amount of equity. It really benefits from denial. I can also get a little bit of value from hands that contain a jack or a queen, a small number of flush draws, and some ace king. I'm generally going to be sizing up on this board. I think my 3-bet defending range has a massive nut advantage here with a much higher concentration of 2-pair sets and straights than the 3-better. I bet 180 into 325. Josue thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. The turn is the queen of hearts. This is clearly a relatively bad card for my specific hand, but I do think that it is good for my range. I think I have a very high concentration of straights and flushes here. I think I can continue with sets at some frequency as well. In this spot, there are very few natural bluffs. I'm not going to have very many single heart hands in a 3-bet pot. Realistically, it's going to be a few hands like ace queen, king jack, and I think that hands like ace queen and king queen don't necessarily want to be betting here unless they have the heart, and even then it's probably going to play more as a check back. Hands like ace jack and king jack have the straight here as well. So I think I have to find bluffs from other parts of my range besides the single heart combos. I think a hand like pocket sevens makes a very good bluff here. I still do have an open ender and I have set outs against some of his hands. If he has a hand like aces, kings that want to continue, and then if he has a set, I have the opportunity to still hit a straight. I think this card is very difficult for my opponent to continue on in general though, unless they have an overpair with a heart, a straight, or a set. I think most of my opponent's range here is going to be made up of queen X and overpairs that are going to have a very tough time continuing. So I do decide to fire out. I fire 325 into 685. Josue thinks for a little bit. He has turned top pair, but again, I think it's very, very difficult for him to continue here when I have a very massive nut advantage. And even if he is good, there's many river cards that are horrendous for him. And if he calls here, he's often going to have to call a third barrel on the river. So he thinks for a little while and he eventually releases the ace queen and we scoop a 1K pot. I open up ace of diamonds, jack of diamonds in the hijack. We get a flat from Bang on the button. Bang has recently sat down at the table, but he has been playing the majority of hands, and he has been playing many of them very aggressively, even multi-way. Chris completes in the small blind. So far, I think Chris has been playing a little bit on the tight side overall, but he's been playing well enough from what I've seen. He's definitely been beat up a couple times, which will play a part in his decisions in this hand. He's had a couple times where he's rivered very strong hands and his opponents have rivered slightly better hands or the nuts. We go to a flop with the pot at $155. The flop is the ace of clubs, 10 of hearts, 3 of spades. Chris checks in the small blind. It gets to me. I think my hand makes a very reasonable bet here, but I'm going to be mixing. I think generally I have a strong holding on this hand, and because Bang has been relatively aggressive, I'm going to check to him and let him float bet if he wants. So I do check, and Bang thinks for a little bit and checks behind. The turn is the 5 of hearts, which brings Chris a straight and a flush draw. I still have top pair, and Bang has nothing. At this point, I decide, with multiple draws coming in against 2 opponents who have not put any money in the pot, that I want to increase the pot size with a relatively strong holding. I bet $100 into 155. Bang thinks a little bit, and he makes the call. It gets to Chris in the small blind. I think Chris can play his hand as a raise or a call here. He thinks for a little bit, and he decides to make the call. The pot is 455, and we go to the river, which is the Jack of Hearts, making Chris the flush. He checks in flow. It gets to me. At this point, I think my hand is still worth a value bet. It is a little less likely that my opponents have a flush when it is a backdoor draw. I also would expect them to be raising a good amount of their flushes on the turn, especially Bang. And I think I can get called here by worst 2-pair combos and some 1-pair combos. Because the board is relatively wet and we're multi-way, I decide to use a smaller sizing. I decide to bet $250 into 455. Bang quickly raises to $700 with complete air here. Chris is sitting here with the flush in the small blind. He thinks for a while and eventually folds. I think this fold is probably fine with me betting and Bang raising. I think in a vacuum that one of us often has a stronger flush than 6 high. Chris has had some pretty bad runouts and he's been running into it, so I don't really fault him for this fold from his point of view. I think that in this specific case that Bang is very aggressive, and I think that Chris should be folding at a lower frequency though because of that. So Chris eventually does make the fold. It gets back around to me, and because I've seen Bang be very aggressive, I do think that I can make the call here at some frequency. I don't really think that Bang is going to be raising a worse hand than me, especially with a player behind. For the most part, his value range is going to be flushes and straights here. After thinking for a bit and seeing some of Bang's aggressive plays on earlier straights, I ultimately do decide to call the $700 raise with my top 2 pair. He shows King 8, we show our Ace Jack, and we win a $1,900 pot. This is the end of the first part of this session. There was way too many hands to fit it into one video, so I had to split it into 2 parts. Overall, this session has gone very well, and there's going to be a couple more massive hands coming up in part 2. I appreciate everyone's support, and I will see you guys for the second part.